Winston Churchill walked into the House of Commons on the 1st of July 1942. He knew before he sat down that the next hour could end his government. 10 days earlier, Tobruk had fallen. 33,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had surrendered in a single afternoon, handing over the war's most strategically loaded North African garrison to a German-Italian force that had no business taking it. The news reached Churchill while he was sitting with Roosevelt at Hyde Park, the president's estate in New York. Roosevelt read the telegram first, then passed it across without speaking. Churchill's response, according to those present, was to ask what America could do to help. Roosevelt's answer came over the objections of his own Army Chief of Staff. 300 Sherman tanks and 100 self-propelled guns, stripped from American armored divisions currently in training, transferred directly to the British 8th Army. When the replacement engines for those tanks were lost at sea on the transport Fairport, the Americans loaded another set onto their fastest available vessel, the Sea Train Texas, and sent it unescorted across the Atlantic to catch the convoy. No other British politician had that relationship with Roosevelt. Nobody in Westminster understood how to replace it. Back in London, the backbenchers were organising. A vote of no confidence had been tabled. Serious politicians with serious followings argued, not quietly, that Churchill's war leadership had produced nothing but a sequence of catastrophic defeats. He survived that vote by 475 to 25. It looks like a landslide. It wasn't. The rebellion collapsed, not because Churchill was unassailable, but because the man leading it, Sir John Wardlaw Milne, stood up in the Commons and proposed making the King's brother the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. The House erupted in laughter. The motion died. Churchill lived to fight another day through a combination of political skill and his opponent's spectacular incompetence. That combination would not survive a second catastrophe. Now, put Erwin Rommel 60 miles from Alexandria at that exact same moment and ask the question no one else is asking. Not what Germany gains from taking it, but what Britain loses. Rommel, in the summer of 1942, was operating beyond his supply chain. His tanks were running on fuel captured from British depots because the Italian merchant navy was hemorrhaging ships in the Mediterranean, with Axis convoys taking brutal losses to Royal Navy submarines and Malta-based bombers. But the deeper constraint, as the military logistician Martin van Creveld documented, was geography rather than naval interdiction. The port of Tripoli, Rommel's primary supply base, could physically unload only around 45,000 tons per month. Rommel needed roughly 70,000 tons per month to sustain offensive operations. Even if the Royal Navy had vanished entirely, the cranes at Tripoli could not move enough material. The overland truck route from those ports to the Egyptian border, stretching over 1,000 miles of desert road, burned nearly as much fuel as it delivered. It gives Germany a canal it can't use in the middle of a desert it can't supply. Most analyses of this question end there. In Cairo in early July 1942, British officers were already burning their classified files. The smoke was visible from the harbour. The question those officers were asking was whether Alexandria would fall before their paperwork did. The question Churchill's opponents were asking back in London was something else entirely. Not whether the military position in Egypt was recoverable, but whether Churchill was. His political position was structurally weaker than his parliamentary numbers suggested. Singapore had fallen in February, with roughly 90,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendering to a Japanese force a fraction of their size, the single largest capitulation in British military history. The 8th Army had been outmaneuvered, outrun, and outfought repeatedly by a force operating at the end of an overextended supply chain. Every defeat produced the same consequence: backbench meetings, newspaper editorials, and growing questions about whether Churchill's confidence in his own military judgment was wartime resolve or dangerous rigidity. The July vote survived because the opposition was fractured and its leading figure destroyed his own motion with a single absurd suggestion. That fractured, incompetent opposition is the last thing standing between Churchill and a genuine political crisis. Now add Suez to that sequence. Alexandria falls, and the Eighth Army retreats past Cairo with no defensible position short of the Palestinian border. Churchill has now watched Singapore fall in February, Tobruk in June, and Suez in September. The men who tabled the July motion return with new arguments, a unified front, and a public that has watched the three most symbolically significant British military positions outside the home islands fall in 7 months. The Wardlaw-Milne problem disappears. The opposition finds a credible leader. The arithmetic that saved Churchill in July does not produce the same result in September. Who replaces him matters less than what his replacement cannot do. Churchill's political survival was the structural foundation of American strategy in Europe, and Roosevelt understood it that way even when his own generals pushed back. Roosevelt's Europe First doctrine rested on a specific and fragile assumption: that Britain remained a functioning military partner, and that the man running that partnership was someone Roosevelt trusted personally and completely. That relationship was not transferable. In July 1942, precisely the period this scenario examines, General George Marshal and Admiral Ernest King co-authored a memorandum formally proposing that the United States abandon the European theater entirely and redirect its primary military effort to the Pacific. Roosevelt killed that memorandum. He killed it because Churchill was on the other end of the phone. Remove Churchill, install any replacement, and Roosevelt has no counterpart to call on the morning that memorandum lands back on his desk. The threat in 1942 was not that a new British government would immediately seek German armistice terms. It was simpler. Political chaos in London during the weeks a new government takes to establish itself creates exactly the window of uncertainty the Pacific First Coalition in Washington needs to reopen the argument Roosevelt had closed. Sir Stafford Cripps, the most likely replacement, was popular, pro-Soviet, and completely unknown to the American military establishment. His war aims might be aggressive. His ability to hold the Allied coalition together in its most precarious year would be untested and probably insufficient. That gap, between Churchill's presence and whatever comes after it, is where Europe First dies. Without a stable British partner, the Pacific First faction wins the internal debate. The strategic bombing campaign against German industry is starved of reinforcements. Germany's western flank grows dangerously quiet, and every formation earmarked for a future second front gets a different set of orders. This is the question the scenario actually turns on, and it has nothing to do with port cranes or convoy losses. It has to do with whether Churchill survives long enough to keep Roosevelt's phone ringing. If you want deep analysis that goes beyond the military argument and into the grand strategy underneath it, this is the channel for you. Because what happens on the Eastern Front when Germany stops looking west changes the entire trajectory of the war. By the summer of 1943, German commanders on the Eastern Front were already watching their best formations disappear, not to Soviet fire, but to Italy. When the Allied landings in Sicily began on the 10th of July 1943, Hitler cancelled the Kursk offensive and ordered elite personnel from the Leibstandarte SS division pulled from the Eastern Front and rushed west. The Luftwaffe, already stripped back from the front to defend German cities against Allied bombing, sent more aircraft toward the Mediterranean. The Atlantic Wall, the fortification system running from Norway to the Spanish border, continued consuming concrete and steel and engineering labor that German planners knew they couldn't afford. Without the Mediterranean front, none of that movement happens. The Leibstandarte's personnel stay east, the Luftwaffe's fighters stay east, and the Atlantic Wall stays unbuilt. Those resources compound against the Soviet position at Kursk. The The result is not a German victory there. The Soviet defensive preparations were extraordinary, the Red Army's capacity for punishment was beyond calculation, and the Soviet Operation Kutuzov counter-offensive into the German rear at Orel was threatening to collapse the northern salient, regardless of what happened at the tip. Soviet operational depth was the primary factor in the German failure. What additional German resources do is make the battle longer, costlier for both sides, and less decisively settled. Without the German collapse that followed historically from Kursk, the Soviet strategic momentum that defined 1944 looks different, but the Eastern Front was only half of where this timeline diverges. The scenario does not produce a German Europe. The factory evacuation beyond the Ural Mountains had already happened, Soviet production was accelerating, and the Lend-Lease supply line, while degraded by an America focused primarily on the Pacific, does not disappear entirely. Germany, in this timeline, probably cannot force Soviet collapse. What it can potentially do is deny the Soviets the decisive operational momentum they achieved in 1944, grinding the conflict into 1946 or beyond, toward a negotiated armistice rather than unconditional surrender. There is one variable this scenario raises that rarely gets addressed. The atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico in July 1945 and used on Japan in August. The aircraft that carried it, the B-29 Superfortress, was a Pacific aircraft not deployed in the European theater. Pointing it at Germany in a still active European war would require a massive logistical pivot, deploying B-29s to British airfields and building an entirely new targeting infrastructure on the continent. Whether that happens before Germany accepts terms, or whether the war ends through negotiation first, is something this timeline opens without answering. Rommel taking Suez doesn't win the war for Germany. The logistics argument is correct. Germany couldn't use the canal, and nobody serious disputes that, but correct and complete are different things. The logistics case was always answering the wrong question. The canal's strategic value was never to Germany. It was to Churchill's political survival, and Churchill's survival was the irreplaceable pin holding together an Allied coalition that Germany could not break on the battlefield. Take that pin out, and the coalition doesn't collapse immediately. It fractures along the seams Roosevelt had been papering over since Arcadia. The Pacific First faction gets its hearing, the bombing campaign starves, and Germany's Western Front goes quiet. The war in the East runs longer, costs more, and ends differently. Rommel at Suez doesn't hand Germany the war. It changes how the Allies win it, when, and what the world looks like when it finally ends. The question this video leaves open is whether Churchill's hold on power was the product of his own political genius or his opponent's serial incompetence. The July 1942 vote survived partly because the man leading the rebellion suggested putting the king's brother in charge of the British Army, and the Commons laughed him out of the room. That kind of luck does not repeat itself indefinitely. Whether a third catastrophic defeat in 7 months produces an opposition that doesn't make the same mistake is the argument historians have not settled. Drop your position below. Subscribe if this changes how you look at what the North African campaign was actually deciding. And thanks for watching.